A topic that's been thrown around for probably the last 10 years or so is the prospect of a Third World War. Before our eyes, we see the relatively peaceful period of the early 21st century just deteriorating before our eyes. The antagonistic axis of a rising China asserting itself on the world stage, or the resurgent bear in Russia, as well as wild cards like North Korea with nukes, or Iran influencing Middle Eastern politics. I mean, it causes us stress for the geopolitical state of the world. And we're seeing wars on a larger scale than most of us can really remember in Ukraine or Gaza. And critically, these wars are being extensively covered within the media. It's not as if there hasn't been any conflict around the world in the past 20 years. It's just none of us really think about it or even really know about it in some cases, mostly down to the fact that it doesn't get covered in the news at all. So I pose this question: are we really seeing a shift from the past? Are trends changing? Or are we just catastrophizing about the future? You could make the point that things have escalated since Russia, seen as one of the world's most powerful military powers, is actively fighting a war against a foreign sovereign nation. And that really raises the stakes because immediately other powerful nations look to counteract the success of Russia to prevent Russia from eclipsing their own military strength. And some powers, of course, also listen to their own moral callings over an unjust invasion, which pushes them to get involved, at least to an extent, through supplying weapons and intelligence to Ukraine. And at the same time, more influential nations have also been influencing events all across the world in recent years. France, for example, until recently fought numerous wars in West Africa in support of the governments that they favoured there. You can also point towards Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war if you wanted to claim that France was no longer a powerful enough nation to be worried about. So intrigue through proxy wars between various powers has been going on for many years now. It never really stopped since the Cold War. It's just none of us were talking about it. So, yeah, you could say there is escalation, given that Russia has blatantly invaded a sovereign nation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a world war. I mean, judging by the way the Ukraine war is going, there's not a chance in hell that the Russians could ever effectively prosecute a war against NATO. And to be frank, I think that this is what most people would expect to be the start of the Third World War. I mean, relatively often I'll see some newspaper headline where some general or some politician warns that conscription will be implemented in the next 5 years in the UK. But looking at how things are panning out, it just looks like unnecessary fear-mongering. And the next likely culprit could be China, say, but they're so far removed from both Europe and America that I just find it really unlikely that any proper invasion could ever occur. And if either side did attempt an invasion, it would be incredibly difficult to land an invasion force on either China or America from the sea. I mean, of course, damage can be caused in other ways. I mean, they could embargo each other, causing the destruction of world trade. The loss of Taiwan and its microchip production would screw over a lot of supply chains. Or perhaps the exchange of long-range projectile missiles can cause widespread damage to both countries. But all of these outcomes aren't necessarily completely crippling. There are ways to deal with them, albeit slightly painful, or more than slightly in some cases. But if it did come to an official war with China, I don't doubt that the draft would become a reality pretty quickly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the soldiers being drafted are partaking in intense conventional warfare, because the distances are just too large. How are you going to send an army to fight in South China over the entire Pacific Ocean? How are you going to supply them? How are you going to keep them supported? I just don't think that that's a possibility. And I know both sides are definitely aware of this. They're not complete morons. So an outright war just becomes much less likely. So in effect, the wars will obviously have effects on all citizens, if of course this war does arrive. But it won't be anything nearly as terrible as any of the first two world wars. I also think there is another major factor, perhaps the most important one that we haven't touched on yet. And it really limits the prospect of war becoming a real thing. And that's support for governments prosecuting these wars from their own populace just isn't there. I mean, already we've seen the effects of this. I mean, during the Vietnam War, Western populations, there was mass social upheaval and protest, and the popularity of government just completely tanked. I just don't think anyone but the most ignorant people aren't aware that this effect would be much, much stronger in the modern day than it ever has been in the past. And I put that down to many people's basic needs just frankly no longer being met in society, whether that's a desire for especially young people to establish their own households independent of their parents, or an inability to meet people and form proper relationships to stave off loneliness. And that has a very large effect on the social well-being of society. I mean, yeah, China are tight-lipped about their side of the story, but from what little hints of information that we can get, it does seem like they're having huge demographic problems as well, which I think also means that their populations are much less enthusiastic when it comes to fighting. So at the end of the day, I just think the news and social media really played much more into people's fears about a Third World War than any actual real geopolitical threats. And it really goes to show just how much society is influenced by the information it consumes, whether this information is true or not. But that is, I think, a topic for another video another day. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.